Hello and welcome to another episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and I'm coming from cold and white northern Germany to you today. We had minus 8 degrees Celsius yesterday and about 20 centimeters of snow outside. So kids are having great fun. It's a pleasure just not to drive in. And today I have something very special for my first recording of 2026 happening. I have a special guest who will have to sit a little through some of my anti-LSU attitude as I introduce him. But we're going to talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest today, which is quite something to chat about, as there's a lot of controversy surrounding that man. But to cut things short, I am joined today by Court Carney, who is an full professor at Stephen F. Austin State University, which relates really pretty to one of our previous episodes where we talked about Texas history. He is there since 2008. And before that, he got a PhD and MA from Louisiana State University, or as my alma mater's fellow students like to call it, LSU instead of LSU. Um, and we were talking today about his book from LSU Press. I feel like there's a lot of LSU here. Reckoning with the Devil, Nathan Bedford Forrest in Myth and Memory. But beyond that, Court has also published The Politics and Power of Bob Dylan's Live Performances with Aaron Callahan and Cutting Up How Early Jazz Got America's Ear and Forthcoming Bob Dylan in the 1980s. So let's start easy. How does a person that is into music history write about an atrocious guy from the Civil War?
Well, that's a curious story. But thank you, Niels, for having me. And I want to say that in Texas right now, it's probably going to be in the low 80s. So you're up, your upper 20s Celsius. So not a white Christmas. Very depressingly hot. However, thank you for having me. And I accept all LSU grief. That's fine. Um, there's a couple ways into this story, and I think one is the my biography of um, uh, pedigree, and I think that what happened was the Forest stuff comes first, and I think the Forest material was an interest of mine way back when. Um, and I got into it and I worked on it, and then I sort of had a shift in direction, and that opened up these other doors. But to put a finer point on it, I worked on forest as my master's degree. So most of what I was interested in had to do with Memphis, Tennessee, and had to do with kind of the memorial structure of the Civil War. And this would have been 1996 or so is when I started. And I worked with at LSU, and kind of why I went to LSU was to work with a professor named Gaines Foster,
Yeah.
who most people on this podcast would know very well, who was one of the early architects, we could say, of sort of lost cause memory. Um, Charles Reagan Wilson and Gaines Foster's books come out, near each other and uh, in the early 80s, and they sort of shape a lot of how we look at things. And so I worked with him with a master's degree, and we really sort of conspired, I would say. He really helped hone my take on, certainly at that point, my take on how this stuff would work. And if you read the book, most of the material that relates directly to the 1905 statue in Memphis is in some part that DNA strand is the master's thesis in 1990 that I worked on in 1996 to 1998. for a variety of reasons that probably don't pertain to the podcast length, I ended up working with Chuck Shendo at LSU for my PhD, and so I cleaved away from kind of Southern history, memorial structure, to cultural history, and I define myself as a cultural historian now. And that shift then put Forrest on the back burner, and then I focused much more on jazz in the 20s. Um, in all candor, I think that division sort of was a challenging one when you're looking how to identify yourself,
Mm.
how to present yourself if you're looking at jobs. And I don't feel that ill at ease at all now, showing how it's basically these cultural forms and how we build them and represent them. But when you're sort of in this period when I was in my late 20s and trying to figure this stuff out, I think I was more apologetic about it, of
Yeah.
like, well, Forrest and this kind of, and it's taken a long
Mhm.
time for me to realize just all the intricacies and
Mhm.
interconnections of all of this. So I don't feel that it's actually all that disparate, but
Mhm.
it is funny to see you have a book on jazz and you have a book on Forrest, and you're kind of like, well, uh, how does this work? But that's kind of the shorthand of how we got into this.
Yeah, I guess I will end up like that too, considering my master's thesis was on civil diplomatic history, and I hope to go back there one day and actually write that book.
I am very thankful that I did a lot of due diligence
Hmm.
with that early period. It was my first experience of doing a research trip, of research trips. It was my first
Hmm.
experience deep in the archives
Hmm.
in Memphis. And that stuff really was a platform. In the early 2000s, I published the journal, the article at the Journal of Southern History, and that sort of was the capstone, I think, for the Forest Project for me. I was like, well, I got the article out.
Hmm.
That sort of as a flag in the sand, and then I went off and did jazz, and then everything else. But I knew there was more to that story. I
Hmm.
knew that the Forest story was interesting beyond what I had worked on. And so over the years, when someone says how long you, and I know you've been in the same position where like, how long have you worked on this book? And you're like, well, 2 years, but actually 15 years or whatever, you're like, the meta history, the meta narrative of this book is actually quite long, but I knew I wanted to get back to it, and I knew I
Hmm.
needed to say something else. And then, not to get too far ahead of us, but what happened is that once the statues come down,
I was just gonna ask that because
yeah,
you're like you wrote this thesis in the late 90s, and in the last 10, 15 years, as you're writing and editing this book for publication, like all things are happening. It's like you
yeah.
can barely keep track of what's going on.
Well, it's funny because when I started, 1905 statue had been around for 90 years, I guess.
Hmm.
Uh, the Nashville statue that everyone knows and makes fun of, the ridiculous 3-story tall fiberglass one, that had just gone up, and
Mm.
so that's actually the epilogue of my master's thesis. It was like
Mm.
he's still there, right? Like
Right.
there's a new contribution to all this in the 15 years after that, 20 years after that, all that begins to shift. And
Hmm.
so when I actually began to work in earnest on the book with actual drafting of the chapters, the conclusion was not he's still there. The conclusion was the collapse of all of this.
Hmm.
Memphis comes down in 2017. Nashville comes down shortly thereafter, and it's like that. Then is
Hmm.
now. I'm not going to suggest to any graduate students listening that you just wait until everything changes. My editor at LSU would not love to say, "Hey, just give me another 20 years and we'll see what things happen." But it does create an endpoint that didn't exist when I was
Hmm.
first working on it. And my attitudes and my thoughts and my take on memory and historical memory also had been so
Hmm.
refined over the years too. But I think that's a very interesting thing to go back to and realize just how radically different
Hmm.
20 years looks when you're talking about a person who died 150 years before all that. And yet, the whole story of how does history work is an
Mhm.
interesting one because it happens very, very quickly and very, very dynamically about a person who has been dead its entire time.
Yeah, and I think that's a fascinating part of this. It's like we're arguing about a person that's long been dead and whose record, whose history is extremely contentious and controversial, to say the least. And that only makes like there there are very few, I feel like, sort of studies where we look at the memory of an individual during the Civil War. We usually at the lost cause in general, but and maybe there's a biographical chapter in there, but yours is unique in that you're really just taking this one person and kind of seeing how over time they evolved in the memory.
Well, I think what I come back to, and I think is very important. I think, especially in terms of the mainstream sort of uh, non-academic world,
Mm-hmm.
is it's important to remember that he was controversial in life.
Mm-hmm.
He was. It's not like someone that people years later were like, was he? People. He was a combative,
Mm-hmm.
contested figure during his life.
Right.
And the other thing I'll add is that at least a chunk of the memorials to him
Mm-hmm.
were contested at the time they went up. So I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people, certainly in the the 2020s, when you start seeing the collapse of Confederate iconography, people were like, well, why all of a sudden? It's like that story. I mean, there's a statue of him that goes up in the 70s that you have black Tennesseans attacking openly, but
Mm-hmm.
that contesting gets written out.
Right.
And so all of a sudden people in 2020 are like, well, how we've never had a problem with this before. It's like, no, there's a whole history, there's a 50-year history of actually combating this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the two prongs of like, even in life, he was a contested figure, and his death has a long arc of coming against him. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that gets forgotten a lot when people sort of have the present bias of like, well, if it's still here, it can't be of that problematic, or however we want to simplify that.
And I kind of was fascinated because, and I kind of curious. I mean, this is it's a new book. You've been working on it for a long time. Did you ever consider that maybe instead of writing this in sort of a perspective of memory, to write it as a biography?
No. Um, I at different times of my career, I contemplated that as a separate idea, yes. This book, I think from the very beginning was a biography of the memory. I think that was really where it started. Um, I think the pragmatic problem that you confront is you also have to get the reader's biography.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are a handful of readers who know everything about Forrest, or perhaps more about Forrest than Forrest knew, who are going to read this and go, "I know all this already." But there's also a ton of people who only have a working idea of the Ku Klux Klan or the Fort
Mm-hmm.
Pillow or whatever it may be. And so part of the structure of the book, one part of the structural question of the book was like, how much do you give? Is it an introduction that kind of gives them a brief
Mm-hmm.
thumbnail sketch? The thing about Forrest, and I've done long thought this, is that he can be easily summarized with slavery and the slave trade,
Mm-hmm.
Civil War in Fort Pillow, and then Reconstruction in the Ku Klux Klan. But each of those points to the point of how history is complicated, each of those points is very slippery
Mm-hmm.
because the slave trade is less slippery. But like, how do we see that within the context of the late 1850s?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Fort Pillow is less slippery than people want to make it out to be,
Mm-hmm.
but it is there's some ambiguities in there.
Right.
And the Ku Klux Klan, by design, is hidden. And you still hear one of the things I always have my antenna up for are people who are critical of Forrest, but then don't have the facts on their side either.
Mm-hmm.
So they're critical of Forrest, but they'll say things like, "Well, he invented the Klan," and none of that's true. He comes in after it's there, but you still see this language, and
Mhm.
it's kind of like, as the historian, you have to kind of say, well, look, you can be anti this, but you also have to be correct in sort
Mhm.
of how you're looking at it. And so there is this idea of how much, and as author yourself, how much do you sketch
Mhm.
out? How much do you provide? How much the editor and the readers want you to to do more or less of? Uh, so yeah, the first chapter of the book, he's alive. The
Mhm.
first chapter of the book is sort of his 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 existence, and then it goes quickly from there of that point on. Um, the thing about Forrest too that people might be surprised to hear is that he was very media savvy. He was very media conscious. His aides de camp were newspapermen in Georgia and Tennessee. He was very crafty in terms of how his image was developed, and certainly by the end of the war and the beginning of Reconstruction, he very much used that to his advantage. So he's not someone who's just doing his thing and then all this stuff is
Mhm.
he's shaping. He has a very kind of almost a modernist spirit in terms of how he's shaping, how he's seen, what he
Mhm.
uh, uh, what he seems like, his identity. All these pieces were something that he was actually aware of, and I think that makes the story a little bit more interesting too.
You would be great on Instagram.
Forrest.
Yeah.
What, as a curated however you want to say, like a curated take on your
Yeah.
life in a way that benefits you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's I don't think he'd be giving his top 20 books or records or something at the end of the year, but I think he would be very good at twisting and, contorting what
Yeah.
the reality is. Yeah,
Yeah, like a little AI generated image of himself in front of like a nice mansion that he doesn't own or something. You would be
right.
great at that. But I want to start actually, oddly enough, in chapters 4 with you because I thought that was is sort of a good way into this and also kind of related to the previous question on biography writing because in chapter 4 you do the images which we can get to later, but you also talk about the evolution of his the writing about him. And biographies can be historic material because we use them in our history writing, but they're also about memory and how we remember a person. And I felt that was really kind of a good chapter and kind of chronicling that intersection between history and the memory of Forrest. And um, so, like, what was your take on like the evolution of Forrest's the Forrest historiography? Let's call it that.
There are two main points going in that I even in the 90s I was focused on. One
Mhm.
was perhaps more known, and that's Shelby Foote. And if anybody came through the 80s and Ken Burns in the 90s, their knowledge of Forrest was primarily due to Foote.
Yep, that's
What
a
are you what are
Shelby
you thinking
Foot.
of?
That's a Shelby Foot volumes up there.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. And Shelby Foote has a incredibly important role in the Forrest story.
Mhm.
So you have that, but you also have Andrew Lytle from Tennessee. And his book I was drawn to, he writes it in the 1930s. His book I was drawn to because it's dismissed. Certainly when I was writing in the 90s, it was dismissed as kind of folk tales. And I was like, but that's kind of the game. Like what Lytle's doing is crafting a hero for his time.
Mhm.
He's sitting there with all these Vanderbilt folks, and he's sort of like this agrarian mindset, and he
Mhm.
was kind of like, that's the guy that has meaning. And so it's not so much that he's fact based because there's a lot of stuff in his book that is ridiculous, but it's because he's putting that stuff together that I think has an impact. And of course, it has an impact genealogically because that impacts Foote. And so Foote and Lytle, that story is pretty important because Foote basically takes the Lytle story and then adds to it. The other important thing, of course, is Foote's a novelist. He's interested in history, but he's coming from a novelist perspective, and we can talk about that 10,000 different ways. So that was the beginning of it. But also in the 1990s, if people remember, you had these two books that were still, or they were brought back into print. One was the original um, military biography that was written during Forrest's life
Mm,
by Pryor, and they that biography comes back into print in the 90s. And also, you have Robert Self Henry's biography that was in every Barnes and Noble, stacks of it, kind of in that remaindered pile. That came out in the 40s. Um, Neither one of those, I think, are uh, without their issues, but they became sort of the bedrock.
mm,
And then, of course, as I'm writing, you had the two new biographies that came out kind of in the post Ken Burns world.
mm,
And those two books, Brian Steele Wills, which is probably the best overall military history of the period of him, and then Hearst's biography, which is probably the best at that point, the best um, uh, kind of detailed look at sort
mm.
of before and after the war. But so those two books are there. What chapter four is about is a little bit different, but that's kind of the landscape I was working with and what I was interested in telling.
Well, and I find it's sort of such a challenge because, like, as you chronicle in the book, it's like, where do you have, like, how do you know what is myth, what is fiction, what is real? Like, it's like, like they're all making stuff. It seems like they're all making stuff up.
Well, when you have the stories that Foote likes to tell of being shot in the side or the back and then picking up a soldier and putting him on the horse as a shield, that's when you're sort of like, is it? What's interesting with the early biographies, when you have like the biographies like by Maithes and the other, they're kind of trying to write themselves into it. The Wyeth
Mhm,
biography, which is the Wyeth's biography at the turn of the 19th 20th century, is the first really kind of legitimate one.
mm,
But then they're kind of writing themselves into the story, and then you have all the different stories of kind of like uh, what I tried to do was like take these moments like slavery with Fort
mhm,
Pillow with the Klan and kind of line them up and see how the biographers sort of deal with it.
mhm,
And they're either dismissive of the slave trade and the Klan, and Fort Pillow is nothing but drunken soldiers, which is sort of the 19th century take.
mhm,
And you can kind of trace how slavery is it's taken more seriously as you
mhm,
get into the 20th century. You can see how Fort Pillow is always going to be divisive within the forest world. But then the Klan, which is sort of dismissed early on, then becomes very much a part of it. So you can kind of use these as barometers of kind
mhm,
of where things are. Certainly after Lytle, so from the first biography in 1868 through Lytle, the factual basis of it is sort of hit or miss. And then after that, Henry's book is very much trying to create a historical record of the war. And so it's a little bit more sober minded. And then it becomes a little bit more by the 1970s you start seeing historians working very very dedicatedly on Fort Pillow as a site and that kind of stuff.
mhm,
So it takes a long time, but you can kind of start seeing the rigor
mhm.
show up in terms of like, is that a real story? Is that not a
Right.
story? I mean, if you look at Wills and Hearst's book, they're pretty sober. They're
Mhm,
very different. And when you get into the weeds, you can kind of see all these differences, and there's some kind of interesting errors and
mhm,
omissions and sort of tensions within those
mhm,
books. I don't know either of them. I don't know Hearst at all, and I have very little to go on with Wills. But I'm not saying from a personal perspective, but you can kind of see that together they kind of
mhm.
fuse a story, and you can kind of see how that works too, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, no, it is, right? Because like that's a challenge, the and it seems like a Civil War era problem in many ways, that you have like such a reliance on like these late 19th century works, whether it's regimental histories or biographies or autobiographies, and there's so much that the authors polish up and reframe, and you kind of, the more I'm kind of thinking of it in other projects, the more I'm kind of like struggling of like, can I take what is in these regimental histories or in these biographies at face value, because I don't necessarily know if they're embellishing.
No, I think it's important. I think it's important too that with Forrest in particular, he's only semi moderately literate, so he's not
Mm-hmm,
writing things down. We do have this tantalizing story, certainly by the time he's in Congress talking about the Klan. We
mm-hmm,
have this tantalizing story of him writing all these letters, or at least dictating letters
mm-hmm,
to be sent out there. And I think it's kind of like, wow, that's kind of the missing. We don't really know where do these show up.
mm-hmm,
So you have that story, but he's not writing his own memoir. People tend to think that first book is because he kind of signs off on it, but
mm-hmm,
it's mostly, if you look at it, 98% of that book is just the war.
mm-hmm,
Uh, so it's not as if they're using the official records and all that kind of stuff. So you have those threads there.
mm-hmm,
But after that, he's kind of everywhere but missing too, because
mm-hmm.
his voice we don't really have. And I think that's kind of an important caveat to all of this.
Right, and that's, I mean, how many times have I interviewed people that do slavery, and it's like, of course we have the difficulty of there's no written record, but then you have Forrest, the stereotypical white man who is a slave owner, slave trader, who also doesn't leave a record.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. What I will say, and this is kind of germane to this, but also a little separate, is that doing the research. So this is kind of like the research side of it. I had two real gold mines, and one is in 1900, 1901, 1902, when they start raising money for the 1905 statue in Memphis, there is a great deal of resources. And
Mm,
in Memphis, in the Memphis Public Library, they had actual these ledger books that had all of this detailed stuff. So I could tell you who gave money for the statue. Like I can give you a pretty good sense of who's doing this, and that was large part of
mm,
the early research. And so someone kept that, and now if people are interested, all of that has been digitized beautifully, and they have the correspondence between the statue, the
mm,
sculptor, and all this stuff exists.
mm,
The other part is a little stranger, but I was in Nashville at the state archives in Nashville, and I stumbled upon a clippings file, which
mm,
those sadly have gone away. Right, we don't really have those where you have these mid-century librarians compiling. But I
mm,
found this cache of advertisements, and
mm,
these would be advertisements that relate to Forrest throughout the kind of mid-century, 20th century. And so it's Forrest as like a for an airliner ad, or Forrest for a candy ad, and he comes up, and someone was clocking this. And what I found out through connecting the file they had with some microfilm that they had is that there's this researcher out in Illinois named Monroe Cockrell. And Monroe Cockrell was kind of the research assistant of sorts of Robert Self Henry, who wrote the biography in the 40s. And what Cockrell ends up doing, for whatever reason, is that he's over in Illinois and he becomes obsessed with Forrest and
mm,
starts collecting all of this stuff. How he does it is a little unclear. Some of it is Midwestern, some of it's not. But he, just this one researcher who's kind of like a Forrest obsessive, sort of collects all this stuff. Somehow his stuff gets to the state archives in Nashville, and it's a treasure trove of stuff. But beyond that, you have this one guy who just happens to, I'm thinking now as a side note, but it's on my mind, is that for the jazz study, for the early
mm,
jazz book, the other important story for me was a guy named Dave Payton, who was a black newspaper writer in Chicago. And
mm,
I'm just now thinking that you have these two sort of Chicago area writers, not writers, but people who become key to the story. But Monroe Cockrell is this kind of odd guy who just obsesses.
mm,
And from the historical perspective, from the from the grad student going into the archives to the scholar in the archives, it's
Mm.
just you need these people.
Right.
Uh, he's the one who's writing letters to Hollywood going, "You're getting Forrest wrong." He's the one constantly, because the minutia
Hmm.
becomes the key. Did
Right.
he say, "Get there first with firstest with the mostest"? Why is that so important? It's incredibly important to the Forrest people because
Hmm.
they want to make him look a certain way. But
Right.
then what Lytle's doing, it's so cross streams because Lytle wants him to be firstest with the mostest
Mm.
because it gives him this weird authenticity
Mm.
that and so you have Lytle's trying to play with the authenticity, and then you have all these researchers after that trying to say, no, he was actually a very sober-minded military
Mm.
general. And I think that tension is sort of what surfaces throughout the book. I think that this narrative of how do we access the past, which is the historian
Mm.
mind at all times. But how do we access the past through these layers that are themselves obstacles? Because I mean, we could speak in terms of ideologies, we can speak in terms of bias, of course, but how do you sort of make sense of this story? And so I think from the 1860s into the 1950s, that almost 90 years is an important sort of uh, mishmash
Mhm.
of of uh, memory and history and how history gets. That's why it's Forrest is history, Forrest is fiction is the name of that title, the chapter, because both are kind of working. You're kind of building the fiction of it at the same time you're building the history of it. And sometimes the historians are the ones working on the fiction, and sometimes it's the fiction working on the history. And I think that you have to understand those dynamics to have an understanding of how Forrest operates and how Forrest then is used, because that's the whole other half of the book is kind of how Forrest is used by people, politicians, civic people, whatever, to their own ends. And I think that's all part of this.
Right. And when you said these newspaper clipping uh, collections, I was taken back to when I wrote my book about Macon. That there was this little file that they had where somebody in the archive in the public library had just every time a newspaper article came out on this building or on this or that topic, just collected them and put them into a file. It was great because I
Yeah.
could pull this file, wrote down all the citations of like on these days something got published in the paper, went to the paper because I wanted the original piece, not just their photocopy, and it made the research process so much easier.
Well, I tell you what, if I in 2000 and 2001, when I'm trying to track down all these 78
Gosh.
recordings and all these
Yeah.
jazz recordings and trying to find these CD and LP box sets that were out of print, if I could be told that everything was within a click here, my mind would have been blown. I feel like when I'm talking about even my PhD dissertation, it's kind of like, well, there's this thing called, a record store, and you had to sort of track. But the same thing with this, right? The idea of um, being able to trace a vertical file through
Mhm.
then the advent of
Mhm.
newspapers.com, which is not everything, but it's a great deal.
Yes.
That's it's the research methods part of it. Um, I've actually given lectures on the research methods part of this because I think it's interesting to see that shift and
Right.
what that means in terms of availability and
Mhm.
accessibility is very, 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 very different from 25 years ago, but it's also
Mhm.
very, very different from like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part of this piece, at least in terms of the historical part of it.
Right. No, it like the ability of what you can find at your fingertips, right? Like I can be in Germany writing a book about like, well, finished most of it before, but I can edit and fill blanks about Savannah, Georgia. Like I don't need to be
Right,
in Savannah, Georgia. I can do it from here. It's
right.
incredible. Like what is available. Like does it? You still want to go to the archive because that's an essential part, but it you don't have to anymore.
The archives, and this is not being a kind of if only things could be the same. But the archives, of course, uh, still have such a, I went to the Vanderbilt archives, and that's what opened me up to the Lytle papers. So Andrew Lytle has all these papers and correspondence between the agrarians, but then also other things. And with the his biography of Forrest,
Mm,
you can literally see where he goes back and puts dialect in. So like
mm,
uh, earlier drafts of the book had children, but then he changes that to chillin,
mm.
which is it's interesting to see how that is an intentional act of his, right?
Right.
But then you have sort of the from the vaguely racist to the overtly racist kind
Mm,
of correspondence, which is not directly related to Forrest, but it gives you a snapshot of kind of
mm.
who he's writing with.
Right.
Some of that's not really from Lytle's own hand, but
Mm,
it's correspondence with him, and you're seeing the very conscious ease of dialect, of black dialect, of southern. These are people who were not necessarily talking that way, but were adopting and borrowing this language.
mm,
And that's where the archives are really important because Andrew
mm,
Lytle's papers are not like your most go-to source for a lot of people, but they're filled with this sort of this filigree of intent and context, um, that you don't get, in other ways. So it's both, but having the ability to track down the actual citations and sources for a
mm.
lot of this material and be able to point to and date and credibly put into
Mhm.
context this stuff is so much more obtainable now.
Agreed. Agreed. So let's let's go sort of a little through the book with some of the stories because you already mentioned one of the overlooked aspects with regard to Forrest is that he was a slave trader. So why? It's sort of a stupid question, but why would we not want to talk about Forrest, the slave trader?
I
Because a lot
think
of
that,
early biographies did.
yeah, I think this is sort of the enigmatic heart of a lot of this because
Mm,
people want to make him into a self-made man. He signs up as a private at the age of 40. That's where he starts the Civil War, and it's this kind of idea like he wasn't a West Point guy. He wasn't all this sort of stuff, which is true,
mhm,
but it's kind of like he's a self-made man through a particular economy.
mhm,
And he has this connection from northern Mississippi to Memphis. This area is very important to him growing up. Hernando,
mhm,
Mississippi, into Memphis is a very important part of it. But he is, I mean, if you want to think about Forrest as an archetypal person, the archetypal person of him is always looking to better himself. I say that without value, but like he's trying to enrich himself early on. He's trying to
mhm,
enrich himself at the end of his life. He's trying to figure out that scheme.
mhm,
Before the Civil War, it's sort of the local industries, but then it becomes slavery and the slave trade.
mhm,
After the Civil War, any New South industry you want to mention, insurance schemes, railroad schemes, whatever it is, Forrest is going to be trying to figure out a way into that. Forest City, Arkansas, which exists today, is basically a railroad scheme of his that leads to that. Having said all that, the Southern historical mindset from the Civil War period onward, for those 50, 60 years, the lost cause part of it, was very keen on sort of separating out the trade from actual slavery. So you have slavery and you have the enslaved culture and economics, and that entire universe was sort of made separate from the actual trade. And I think for a long time people would argue it's the trade was seen as like an embarrassment, and I don't really think that's true, but they wanted to write out the traders who were making
mhm,
this system work. These were low lifes, these were ne'er do
mhm,
wells, and I think it was trying to figure out a way to prop up slavery
mhm,
in a much more meaningful way for these predominantly white writers who wanted to
mhm,
make sense of this for them. So the trader doesn't make sense culturally,
mhm,
but the slave trade, but slavery only makes sense with the slave trade. So Forrest, who's making money off of selling human beings as the middleman,
mhm,
is seen as an unlikable, dislikable person who's also on Main Street Memphis, who also is openly in the newspapers, who is making a lot of money and then becomes an alderman in the city. None of this is hidden. And that's the thing, too. Forrest isn't hiding any of this. Newspapers were talking about it. Early in the Civil War, you have Chicago and New York newspapers remarking on this. By Fort Pillow, the Forrest story is slavery, 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 slavery. And I say this all the time, but I want to make clear too that a lot of the military resources and resourcefulness that Forrest shows in the early part of the war is all related to slavery. His 1861 and 1862 exploits and his ability to keep his men together has a lot to do with the fact that he knows all the trade routes from northern Mississippi into Kentucky. And his knowledge of Kentucky and Tennessee and Mississippi is not because he just is a flaneur walking through the streets. It's because he's a businessman working with slavery and knows all these connections all across and up and down the Mississippi River. And I think that is a very important part. It's like, oh, he's a self-made man, but he's a self-made man only within the context of kind of myth. So how this plays out in memory is really interesting. But the reality simply is that he becomes a wealthy, wealthy, wealthy man because of the trade of enslaved peoples, including men, women, and children. This idea that he didn't split up family, none of that stuff is true. And then you have sort of, well, how do we talk about this, but also maintain him as a military hero, all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of complications, even with people who wanted to tell the story their own way. You just have to kind of ignore a large part of it.
Right. In part, I think that leads directly to the other aspect that makes him a national figure in sort of the negative, which is Fort Pillow.
Yeah.
And
Fort Pillow, Fort Pillow is fascinating in the aggregate and it's fascinating in the molecular, because if you look at the molecular part of it, it's sort of just one more piece of what Forrest is doing in 1864.
Right.
By 1864, Charles Royster, the late historian who I worked a little bit with at LSU, but Charles Royster had an ability to sort of, I mean, he was a very, very funny person, and in his books, I don't know, are ripe with humor, but he was himself very funny, and he had this pithy way of summarizing Forrest, which has stayed with me the entire time, and that was, he was a major player in some minor battles and a minor player in some major ones. I mean, that sums up the entire 4 years of the Civil War. By 1864, he's kind of doing these, not guerrilla attacks, but he's kind of he's just kind of doing these raids.
Right.
And the story of Forrest in 1864 is just kind of going where the story leads him. And that's how he gets to Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow is not some well thought out thing. And when Fort Pillow starts, when you have this Confederate fort that has the ungainly name Fort Pillow, and then for Gideon Pillow, and then it becomes a Union fort, and then it's on the river. This story is really interesting. And when he ends up at Fort Pillow, he actually, it's sort of like he's not even the architect of it, because he arrives late in the morning. The surrounding of Fort Pillow, it just is kind of a thing that is almost like a fait accompli. Like, of course it's going to happen this way. Not to say anything about what happens after, but like all the pieces of the chessboard make sense, because you have him kind of going on these raids. You have this story of uniformed black soldiers in an area. I know this was a particular interest of yours with like the race riots in Memphis afterwards. But you have these stories that are very difficult to tell historically, but we know that you had former enslaved men in the Memphis area who get into the USCT as black Union soldiers, who are then stationed very near where they had lived as enslaved workers, survive that, and then end up coming down to Memphis and being part of the Memphis riots in 1866. I mean, if you could trace some of those stories, which are almost impossible to actually document, I've done a little bit of it, but it's an amazing story of sort of like individuals who survived all of this brutality and trauma, who then put their lives back together if they can get through all that in the 1860s before yellow fever them destroys Memphis is a fascinating human story. But then Forrest gets involved in this. Early biographers blame all the violence on black Union
Mhm.
soldiers. And then after that, here's the other important point I think people need to know. After that, Southern newspapers thought Fort Pillow was a tragedy too. Southern newspapers were saying, "Yeah, this isn't great."
Mhm.
The bloodshed, all the stories of
Mhm.
post surrender death, murder, all that stuff, whether it was amplified a bit or complete invention, there's a continuum there. But there is a large number of stories that then become in the Southern press as like, ugh, right?
Mhm.
Chicago and New York papers seize on it. That's where we get a lot of the stuff. That becomes a congressional investigation, which then, but it's interesting to see like it's not clear cut regionally.
Mhm.
Southern Southerners, white Southerners were not ecstatic about some of this.
Mhm.
White Northerners were using it politically,
Mhm.
however you want to look at that. But it becomes a story that only congeals later. Then, of course, by the end of the Civil War, it's nothing but Southern versus Northern
Mhm.
perceptions. But it's a really messy, really murky story in 1864 into 1865. But it's the most important story of Forrest up until the Klan. If you look at the Thomas Nast drawings of Forrest, it's all Fort Pillow related.
Mhm.
Fort Pillow dies off in his memory by the turn of the century, and it's mostly a Klan story. But Fort Pillow was the most important story that followed him to his death.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder because Forrest is, and you chronicle some of that in the book. He he he's not the most gloves on kind of fighter. He's not the nicest of soldiers. He has his own code of, say, let's say, codes that he operates under. So
And
and
his
and
soldiers buy into it too. The people
right,
fighting with him
yeah,
buy into it. No quarter, whether that's a bluff or not, it doesn't matter. They know.
right.
It's that ferocity. He
Mm-hmm.
by 1864, certainly before that, but by 1864, he knows he's got this myth of ferocity, of
Mm-hmm.
ferociousness that can get him victories just through fear, and he's completely part of that. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, his soldiers are not like, oh my goodness, he wants us to do what? No, they're
They're
like
on it.
they know the score and they know what's happening. And when Fort Pillow either intentionally or falls out of control by the mid-afternoon, no one could have been surprised. And of course, there's other stories that play into this, and of course, there's stories after this. But I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that Forrest, for all of his the way he saw himself, I think Forrest himself didn't think Fort Pillow was a big deal. I think it kind of maybe I'm speaking a little ahistorically here, but might have even surprised him a bit. It's like, why is this one
Mm-hmm.
following me? But then he used it, of course.
Yeah, but that's what I was kind of going for, like, right? It's like he has done so many atrocities of various natures, and that's the one we pick.
Well, you pick that, and then also, he ends up murdering a black man after the
Right.
the war, and it takes very long to hit
Mm-hmm.
the memory. So the memory is interesting because you have the early part of the memory of Forrest is, of course, very much this racialized,
Mm-hmm.
racist piece, but it wouldn't work if it was just that.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't work if it was just, oh, he's a white supremacist and I value that.
Mm-hmm.
That's not how it'd work on any longevity scale. The reason it works is because he plays off as a civic story. He
Mm-hmm.
plays off as a regional story of loss within
Mm-hmm.
the lost cause. Um, it's only if it was only one thing, it would either be it would be an all or nothing thing that may
Mm-hmm.
play out very differently. The reason Forrest is so complicated in memory is because it is all of these other things. Well, he was a great warrior. I'm not going to get into whether or not that's true, but he was a great warrior, untrained, all this. He never surrendered, which isn't true. Um, the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan's interesting because a lot of people ran away from the Klan with
Hmm.
Forrest. Like they didn't want to claim the Klan as a Forrest thing in the late 19th century until it becomes sort of like that's exactly who he is, right? And so by the 1980s and 1990s, it's because it's all these colorful stories, uh, a Western theater person outside of the Eastern story of Lee and Jackson and Grant and all of that. He's I think there's something to do with the fact that he's a cavalry guy. I think
Hmm.
kind of the horse soldier part of it is
Yeah.
sort of intriguing to people where it's like, oh,
Hmm.
who's this guy? He's not in the history books, but he's sort of like this guy that no one really knew by the 80s and 90s. And so he
Hmm.
works on a wide scale. And so when you get to Ken
Yeah.
Burns, who gives a very sober assessment to all of this, I
Outside of
will
Shelby
say,
Food.
I did reach out to the Ken Burns people. This. I have not said this out loud, but I did reach out to them as I was
Mm.
drafting that part of it. And it's like, would he be interested in talking
Mm.
about any part of this
Right.
without, having to? I didn't need him to sign on to anything I was saying,
Right.
um, but he was incredibly busy. But I did
Mm.
reach out to him. I did
Yeah.
reach out to the Ken Burns people, but I think that Ken Burns has surrounds himself with legitimate scholars, Barbara J. Fields and others. He surrounds himself with people. What's funny about all of this is that he gets to foot through Robert Penwarren, and Robert Penwarren, of course, connects us back to
Mm.
Lytle. Penwarren and Lytle were Vanderbilt people. So basically, Penwarren says you should talk to Shelby Foote. Shelby Foote gets into the documentary, and then he gives a very. I mean, when we get to whatever it is, episode 7 or whatever it is of the Civil War, it starts with Forrest, and it's all
Mm.
Forrest, and it's
Mm.
it's it's the colorful language, and it's the I talk about this in the book, but this idea that Foote talks about waving the sword around
Mhm.
his head, and it's such an interesting telescoping of time because you're watching
Mhm.
that in the 80s. The woman he's talking about had died in the 50s. So
Mhm.
that's a 30-year period
Mhm.
that he's kind of collapsing into a recent story. I'm
Mhm.
not saying that's even it's not malicious, but it's an interesting
Mhm.
telescoping of time that if you're watching this, you're like, oh, this is all very
Mhm.
current, and this is someone who's lived this period. I mean, we could talk about Foot for hours upon hours. I think Foot is
We can do that a second
incredibly
time.
important. What's that?
We can do that for a second episode.
Yeah, Foot is incredibly, and what's so interesting about Foot is that he himself is complicated. Like he
Mhm.
himself has certainly in the 40s and 50s progressive attitudes as
Mhm.
for white Southerners in the 40s and 50s in terms of blues music, in terms of really enjoying like Robert Johnson, and he was an early interested person in people like Elvis. I mean, there's all sorts of parts of Foot that are really fascinating. Um, Later in life, he says a lot of different things on the record that are eyebrow raising. Um, but you can't sum him up easily either. And I think that's the other part that people want to be very dismissive of him. And I understand the desire to, but he's not that simple either.
Yeah,
None of the
but I will have to ask now. How many times have you watched the Civil War documentary?
Well, I watched it quite a bit
Okay,
when I was when I was
well,
younger.
I
When you
think
go
I only
back
watched
to
it once.
it, it's because I went back when I was doing the book. I went back and
Mm.
watched the entire thing to kind of track where Forrest shows up, and he kind of bounces
Mm.
around here and there. But I had forgotten how much of it is just. I think it's episode 7 near the end
Mm.
when it's like Forrest, Forrest, Forrest,
Mm.
Forrest.
Wow.
And it's like, and that has such a stranglehold on the mindset because when Foote says
Mm.
something like the two big heroes of the Civil War are
Mm.
Abraham Lincoln and Nathan Bedford Forrest, that is wild. That's a wild statement,
Mm.
Niels. It doesn't make sense. But at the time, it's like, oh yeah, this guy,
Mhm.
he's he's not saying that they're equal, of course, but he's saying they're the two important things. And the
Mm.
impact that would have on people watching it who have no concept of anything is huge. And
Yeah.
that's why by the 90s, you have the two new biographies, Hearst and
Mhm.
Wills, but you
That's
also
interesting.
have politicians talking about Forrest throughout, in kind of ridiculous manner. He is more present in the 1990s when I was writing my master's thesis than he had ever been. And that's kind of the important point to keep in mind too.
So that I have to kind of real quick check something because you got ahead of me. But you think that Kershaw was influenced by the sort of Forrest sort of reemergence as sort of by Shelby Foote as a heroic figure in when he puts up his monument in or statue?
The Nashville, okay.
I know we
Um,
jumped a little ahead. We just to go
no,
back
no,
to
no, no, no.
Memphis.
It's I'm very much want to talk about this, but I think that um, okay, so the statue that goes up in outside of Nashville is partly, I think, related to that, maybe even mainly related to that, but it has an overlay of some of the worst aspects of this entire story. So
Yes.
Kershaw, who is this here's what's fascinating about the book. I mean, not the book, but the story into the book is that Kershaw looks he died looked ridiculous. The statue seems ridiculous, and he was easily caricatured as this crank anti-artist because the story is basically it's on private property and he kind of goes and just starts carving it out, and it's a ridiculous looking thing
I've seen
when
it.
it exists.
It's
Yeah,
it was insane.
when it existed, it was always, I had so many friends who would write me going, is that gonna be the cover, is that gonna be the cover, is that gonna be, and it's like, what I ended up getting into was tracing Kershaw's story in Nashville from the 50s into the 60s, and he was a artist. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he was interested in art himself. He was interested in being kind of a correspondent of
Mm-hmm.
Nashville art culture. He writes newspaper articles like on an Egyptian exhibit who comes through.
Mm-hmm.
He is not some anti-artist crank, and yet he's also an anti-artist crank. And I think that he becomes obsessed with this sort of white supremacist line. Now, I say very clearly in the book, I don't think there's a moment when he is like, I am an artist with a racist subtext, and now I'm going to be a racist with an art. I don't think there's a moment,
Mm-hmm.
but I think if you look at Kershaw, you're going to be struck by the fact that he's kind of a curious fellow in the sense that whatever happens in the 90s, and you can trace all that back to the 50s and 60s, he's also sort of not what he seems to be, which is he's not a caricature on some level. He becomes one, I suppose. But then, of course, he gets involved with uh, the killing of King. He becomes King's assassin's one of his legal attorneys
That was
after he
fascinating.
escapes after he escapes from prison. Um, he becomes more and more of what we say is. In no way am I an apologist for Kershaw, but I think a deeper look at Kershaw at least makes you think that it's not something. There is a book that came out when I was working on this book by a guy named Connor Town O'Neill. And he wrote a book on Forrest and the statue that scared me to death because, as we all know, you're working on a book forever. Then all of a sudden, CNN has a news of a new book, and you're like, well, great. And I got his book as fast as I could, and I was like so nervous. And I was very relieved to find out most of the book is nothing I would have written because it was very much about his life and all that kind of stuff. And the stuff that he did write about that did connect to what I was writing about was very useful. But O'Neill, who very graciously blurbed the book, by the way, so I feel like there's some kindness between us. O'Neill has a great comment where he refers to if you when you look at the statue, it looks like a fever dream, like this sort of wild, hacking away, like the way O'Neill tells the story is like he kind of was like so much was there, and then Kershaw was like, I've got to get this out, And instead of having like a Michelangelo moment of carving out of marble this beautiful musculature, he ends up hacking out of polyurethane this sort of ridiculous
It's a
thing.
disproportionality, right? Of like
Yeah.
the tiny
And
head
he's got
with
a
the big
gun
butt.
and a sword. He's basically the thighs. You don't ever want to think about Forrest thighs, but Forrest thighs have to be clutching the horse, to keep him. It's a very peculiar thing. It becomes a model of a
Mm.
targeted audience because people
Mm.
shoot at it constantly. It's constantly vandalized and then it gets torn down. And when they're bringing it down, it completely breaks apart. Like
Mm.
like the 1905 Memphis statue still, as far as I know, still exists in some capacity somewhere hidden away. But this one doesn't. It's a complete disaster. What I really wanted to do was have like a photo essay sort of showing the 1905 statue and then the empty pillar, the
Mm.
empty that happens in 2017, and then the Nashville statue with its empty
Mhm.
base. I wasn't able to really do that graphically in the way that I
Mm.
wanted, but I was able to get a really good picture of a photographer who took a really great. It's the photograph near the end of
Mhm.
the empty
Right.
pedestal, and it just kind of blows apart, which I think is an apt summary to how all this
Mhm.
works.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed that section. But it's sort of it's just the weirdness of it, the monstrosity of it, right? Like the whole like you were just, yeah, like you said, it's like just rushing it out to get a statue up, and then it sits there next to the interstate so that everyone can see
Yeah,
it. But it's the same like with every monument. It's about the visibility of seeing this
yes,
person.
yeah. But I think it's also what you were saying, the monstrosity or the peculiar nature of it, the weird nature of it.
Right.
I think is important too because in some ways it's serving the same function as the very mannered 1905 statue
Right.
in many ways. But it also becomes, is anybody sad to see it go? But I think there were.
Mhm.
And I don't want to be too coy here. What Kershaw was arguing in his belief system is repulsive, and certainly by the end of his life, he's saying a lot of really terrible things, and that does represent what that statue represents. The statue represents the artist's intent as much as anything else. But I think that it's an important piece to this that I don't think you could do better with source material than a bronze 1905 statue built by someone who built other statues across the 20, American landscape. And then this sort of, you know, if you want to be kind, folk art sort of anti-art statement. I think that they work so well in terms of punctuation marks.
Mhm.
And then they both get torn down. One thing I want to say to go back to a comment you made earlier, one thing to keep in mind too is that Memphis, which is such an important part of the story, Memphis is in many ways the story, but the way Memphis deals with all of this is important too, because if you
Mhm.
go to where Forrest sold human beings, that now is a parking lot to a church, and it's now on BB King Boulevard. And I think that's such a indication as to how memory collapses upon itself. I mean, you
Mhm.
can stand in, there are parts of Memphis where you can stand and you can see the low areas of Memphis, which define the idea of the swampy nature of it, the yellow fever aspect of it. You can still see the contours of the city
Mhm.
geographically if you stand in a certain place. But then the Forest statue in 1905 is right next to what had been the predominant black hospital, which is
Mhm.
where King was taken after he was shot, which is right near the Lorraine Motel, which is right near I Am a Man, where that takes place, which is also very close to where you have these Civil War memorials and sites. And then, of
Mhm.
course, if you go up just a half a block from where Forrest statue was, you have Sun Records. It's all of, and that's kind of the power of myth
Mhm.
and memory, where even in a city that's not planning these stories,
Mhm.
BB King Boulevard now abuts a parking lot which used to be a slave pen. That then is close to where maybe you have the better part of Southern culture of white and blackness within the music. which is next to the dark story of segregation. And
Hmm.
Forest Park, of course, was also segregated. And and
Right.
and you talk to people who couldn't walk through Forest Park, so Forest Park itself was an image of forest, but it was also a white only
Hmm.
space, and how that gets taken over by a university, and how that's close. In other words, you could create this universe of
Hmm.
multiple layers where you even to this day can stand, and in Memphis you can see all the strata, right?
Hmm.
And I think that if I did anything in the book that I hope comes out is that this is as much of the story as anything else of how this complicated sort of layering is is the cultural narrative, and that someone in 1905 can think all of these terrible things, and then you have this statue, and then people in 2017, the people in Memphis say enough is enough, and that story I don't think we have time to go into, but there's all sorts of pieces in that that are kind of fundamental to our understanding of space, southern cities, and how even accidentally these layers get built and concretized and obliterated and all of that. And I think that, if anything, is the historical piece at the end of saying that Forrest comes from this overlayering of omission and fiction and overriding and underwriting.
Right. And I think that's what sort of I do want to get to the Memphis story finally too, but I think that you kind of foreshadow, you're kind of hinting at something really interesting of like how Kershaw's death really kind of raises these questions of like, what do you do with the Forest statue in Nashville, and how then the kind of ownership issue and landowner issue, and kind of just we don't really know what to do with it, so let's just get dismantle it.
And it
Whereas
kind of just
Memphis,
disappears.
I love I always love the way Memphis dealt with Forest, and I think Jefferson Davis was there too, of these statues that they just like, all right, by state law we can't remove them, so let's figure out another way how these monuments can go.
It's all this sleight of hand, and like Forest Park, very early on, gets sold off to the University of Tennessee Health Center. So then it's not, part of it is what we would call sort of politicians covering their ass, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a little bit of like, well, it's not civic space anymore, it's this,
Right.
and then the place that owns it's like, well, it's not our responsibility. We only here to maintain it.
Yeah.
All of these different pieces play into it, and it's sort of on a gracious level you want to
Mm-hmm.
say it's people who can't confront it openly because of the politics and the culture, but kind of
Mm-hmm.
undermine it.
Yeah.
If you want to look at it from a different perspective, it's people who then are just sort of like chipping away at
Mm-hmm.
something without actually taking action. That's not necessarily how I view it, but I think there's a way of looking at it that way, where you can say, well, you're just kind of kicking the bucket and saying, well, kicking the can down the hill,
Right.
where it's not your problem anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a part of that. But it's also the difficulty because you start having state, maybe some local, but certainly state ordinances that make it very
Mm-hmm.
difficult. And we haven't mentioned this yet. The Memphis statue is unique because it was also where Forrest was reburied, so reinterred. So Forrest as a statue is also Forrest as a grave site, and that has its own protections. It's all of this stuff built together. The other thing about Memphis is Fort Pillow's important here too, because if you look at the Fort Pillow story of death, where you have these fallen soldiers who are buried in a trench and then reburied in mass graves and then reburied in the Memphis cemetery. That story is really phenomenal. But the
Mm-hmm.
same thing happens is mirrored by Forrest. Forrest is buried in Elmwood Cemetery. Elmwood Cemetery then is where he and his wife are buried, and then that becomes an empty grave because they dig him up and put him underneath the statue. And I then suppose that he was then reburied there after they remove all of it. And then, of course, as a punctuation mark, if you go to Elmwood Cemetery and find Forrest's grave, you are probably about 20 yards away from Shelby Foote's grave. And so it's all this web.
They're all sitting next to each other.
They're all sitting next to each other. They're all right there in
Well,
death and in life. Yeah.
yeah, and then on top of it, like, right, like you have the Fort Pillow massacre near there, you have the Memphis massacre, you have Forrest sitting in there. It's like it's a very contentious environment in which this statue and this man is being commemorated, especially if you think of like the racial aspect of white
Right.
black
Uh,
Memphis.
and talking from the viewpoint of calling it a race riot, which is not how we see it now, but seeing as the race riot as it was defined as the Memphis massacre, as we should label it, of black Memphians, that's all part of this story. And I think that the just to put it in perspective, the story I started carving out in the 1990s is the same story today, which is the story of Memphis. And you have black
Mhm,
Memphis actually having a moment of strength after the Civil War because you
mhm,
have a white death and a fair degree of white flight before what we would call a
mhm,
pattern of white flight. You have people living in the city because of the mosquito-borne illness, and so then that story is that by the 1870s and 1880s, Black Memphis, you have IDB Wells and others, Black Memphis is pretty important in so many
mhm,
ways, and that's one of the reasons why by 1905 you have like kind of a reclamation by
mhm,
white Memphians to say this is actually a white city.
mhm,
And I think that part gets sort of just kind of maybe covered up a bit too, where it's actually the social remaking of
mhm,
Memphis and the societal remaking of Memphis into a white city after it had been kind of a much more of a black city after the
mhm,
Civil War is incredibly important to all this. There's a reason why 1905 happens the way it does, and
mhm,
there's a reason why the Confederate reunion happens in 1901 in Memphis. There's a reason why you have all of this stuff going on, trying to recreate or reclaim or to claim anew a white supremacist community that had not really existed in any real power structure before that.
Well, and in many ways, the story of Memphis is a story of Civil War monumentation in the South in general, right? Of like, okay, we're at the turn of the century, the soldiers are dying, we're back in power as white Southerners with Plessy v. Ferguson and other decisions. So now we want to make sure that we project that with statues in various
Right.
forms.
Right. It's right. Exactly. And you have, I think, when you look at the Memphis statue in 1905, it's all of that, plus kind of like a bit of a throwback to like
Mhm,
these equestrian statues. But then, you know, I think that story then has its own life after that. Like I think there's a lot of reasoning why it makes sense in 1905, but then what happens is that by 1945, 1950, it just is. You know, the
mhm,
statue is, and it
right,
is because it's kind of forgotten as civic statues tend to be, but it's also just like what's always been here. And I think that bias of thinking if the statue's here, the statue's always been here. In my lifetime, it's always been here, then you're kind of thinking, well, then it has a permanence to it.
mhm,
And the reality is, by even World War II, by the end of World War II, it was only 40 years old. And a lot of the people clamoring for it in 1945 were there when it was put up. But that sort of complex memory, right? That
mhm,
that way of viewing things, which is not a Southern story, but it's very much a Southern story,
mhm,
is all of this of like how do you comprehend all of these different pieces at one time? And I think it's such a example of that. And then when it comes down because in no small part because of Black Lives Matter, because you
mhm,
start seeing the the internal community
mhm,
of Black activists using it as a target,
mhm,
and that leads to it finally crumbling. So I think
right,
all of that is part of the Memphis story. What happened
mhm,
in Memphis in 1868 is why Memphis in 1905 looks like way.
mhm,
The reason Memphis in 1905 the way it looks is the reason why Memphis in the 90s and into the 2000s looks the way it does. It's
mhm,
all the Memphis part of it.
right,
And what you say to people is like, well, yes, the city of Memphis, white Memphians put it up in 1905, but Memphis brought it down. I mean,
right.
that's how these things work.
Mhm,
It's not as if they can only build. And what I've also long said, and I think other people say the same thing too, is that building these statues obliterates as much as anything else. You
mhm,
build a statue, you're obliterating any sort of
right.
nuance or other counter narrative,
Hmm.
you've obliterated all of that. So to think that by tearing that monument down, you're only destroying something, you're actually allowing for these
Hmm.
multiple viewpoints to come back into place that were always there. Again,
Yeah, and that's what people tend to forget, right? Monuments are not are putting one person on a pedestal, but they're not about what history is because it eradicates all that complexity, the kind of fun and dirtiness of it.
right. And even in positive circumstances, even if you put a positive, you found the most, you know, ridiculously positive person you could ever do to put up there, you're
Yeah.
still saying this is the image, this is what it looks like.
Hmm.
It concretizes all of this. So that's just the nature of these things. But when you've had it built into your own ideology or own consciousness in so many different ways, it becomes like a personal attack. I'm not saying I'm not immune to those feelings, not in this particular case, but you know what I mean. I mean, I can understand the human
Hmm.
mind enough to understand that
Yeah.
sometimes you just feel like you're fighting this battle that you're losing. But um, in these particular cases, there's so much stuff that you could build into and go, well, I keep self-editing myself in terms of things I would say to take us off course. But this idea of like history's bigger than you, and history's
Right.
bigger than your take on it, and history is bigger than you wanting to hold on to this one 1905 idea that you've reduced to one thing that you can believe in. It's so much larger than that, it's so much bigger than that. And to have an understanding that it doesn't represent all viewpoints, and in fact represents a very specific type of viewpoint,
Mhm.
is very difficult for some people to latch on to.
Well, it seems also that in many ways the statue is very much what Forrest always was. He was a showman that very much was aware of what he wanted to project to others because you have these, I think it was three images that you talk about at the start of chapter four, where you have kind of like the photographs that he takes and how he's uncomfortable with sort of how they project who he is, how he looks, and that comes out in the statue, right? Where it gets the tailor's measurements of like
Right.
how broad were his shoulders, how tall was he, like every like trying to get all these details right about the person.
Again, for time's sake, we probably can't get into all this, but I would urge, if people are interested, there's a whole thing about the physicality of Forrest that I don't think is only Forrest, but you don't see it that much of almost this sort of obsession with
Hmm.
his body, his size, his height, the way he looked.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that other soldiers or generals don't have this, but it's pretty unique to him in terms of kind of the and this is going to sound weird to people who haven't looked at the book, but the idea of the sexualization of Forrest,
Hmm.
of this sort of uh, broad-shouldered, tall,
Hmm.
swarthy guy who has several images of him, but the one image that keeps coming back has like this very kind of glowering, goateed, uh, almost haunting visage that plays well in the 1990s. If you want to look at Forrest's brothers, and I say this in the book, their names are ancient sounding names. They look like they come from the 18th or 19th or early. They look like they come from the past. But Forrest, his hair is a little long, his goatee's a little specific. It's like
Yeah.
you could see Forrest in the modern world, and I think that part is the unconscious part of like Forrest. When you're talking about people that you want to obtain, and you want to talk about people who go, I like Forrest and I want to engage with Forrest, he makes it easier to do than seeing someone that looks like they came from, the Celtic, fifth century, or you know what I mean? Like
Right.
this actually is like, oh, I know a Forrest.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's an important part of it. That is hard to document, though I try to do my best in terms of documenting where it is. But of like where people are just like, this guy is he, um, there is a brutal charisma to him that lasts and lingers in a way that you don't see that often with people like this.
Yeah, and it's just the it's also the silences in this, right? That you already mentioned a few times that by kind of saying, "Oh, it's always been there," you ignore that African Americans did oppose, and you have a number of kind of stories in there of individuals like Ida Wells that are like they're not in favor of what Forrest stands for, what Forrest looks like, and what his embrace by the city would mean.
I talk about Wells for a number of obvious reasons, but Wells is important too because it shows that there is a narrative and
Hmm.
a skepticism that predates all of this, the statue, and I think that's important. It's also important to talking to people in Memphis and talking to people who had grandfathers or great grandparents who lived through this, what they said they were passed down to isn't in the book because to document some of that stuff was kind of difficult as from the historical record. But knowing that this was something that lingered within the Black community for decades is important to understand. And that when you get to the 1970s and you have there's a bust of him, a bust of Forrest is put into the state capitol building in Nashville. The fact that you had very loud opposition to that, black opposition, and maybe some non-black opposition to it, is incredibly important to the story. And that's what I led the conversation with. But that is the story. Um, Kershaw, the Kershaw statue is not a civic reminder of anything. It's one person on
Hmm.
private land creating something that's very visible. And I think you rightly bring up the fact that there's it's visible, but it's also private. It's the most visible part of the story, but it's also completely protected through private means. I mean, it's not protected from being shot at, but it's protected from standing for the most
You could
part.
still get to it over the
You can,
interstate. I mean,
every story of the Kershaw story is like, well, there's bullet holes in it. People launched arrows into it. It got covered in pink paint a number of times. So yeah, no, you can still get to it. But this idea that I think that tension of being very public and very noticeable uh, south of Memphis, and also, I mean, south of Nashville, but also untouchable, is I think a strong idea. I mean the last time I saw the Memphis statue when it was standing, it had been covered in paint as it had been there. I had seen it with like KKK written on it repeatedly. They had continually had to do that, but that's in the very modern era in the last few years of its existence. Um, I don't know how often that happened beforehand. Um, you say in the 50s and 60s. Also, I will add when you think that the story is going to be very loud, when you kind of anticipate when you're looking at this at the story of the memory and you're thinking it's going to get really loud in 1964 and 1965 is when the story is actually troughs and the forest the stories of Forrest are almost non-existent in the 60s, which is so fascinating because you think it's going to be um, uh, in proportion to like all these other stories, but it doesn't work that way. Forrest kind of hits a peak in the 40s, and then it sort of drifts, and then it comes back in the 70s. It's fascinating that you think, oh, well, of course, the centennial, blah 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 blah, and it doesn't look the way you think it's going to. And then by the 1990s, it has a resurgence that you would never have anticipated because of a PBS documentary. So it's just those are the kind of surprises when you go in going, well, it's going to get heated during the Civil War centennial. And it's like, Forrest
nothing.
never disappears.
Speaking of surprises, is there anything that surprised you in the course of like the removal that took place? Like, did it surprise you that it was the way it was done, the quickly it was done, the kind of public reaction it received?
That's an interesting question. I think the removal of the 1905 statue was something that there was a little bit of a, I don't know if you'd say a buzz, but there was like
Hmm.
a kind of an uptick.
Yeah.
And I, uh, I was aware of like an uptick in action,
Hmm.
but then it was like, bam. You know, I
Hmm.
remember on social media, looking on social media and seeing like television crews show up and it was at night
Hmm.
and it was like gone. And I remember thinking like how amazing it is to consider something that, I mean, to make it a personal story, something that I had dealt with for a long time, to make it a civic story, something that Memphis, of course, had to deal with for a long time.
Hmm.
And it's a story that seems so um, uh, unbreakable. It was like, this is just the narrative we have from 1905. It's always going to be this, and then within 45 minutes is gone. Um, that was interesting. I was less surprised by the Nashville statue because I think by that time it was clear that that was going to,
Mm.
once Kershaw died, it was pretty clear that was going to go away pretty quickly. But like, I think I was really caught off by just the idea that something that you thought would all, even if you are countering that story,
Mhm.
it shows how strong it is that it exists. It's always going to exist, and then in 45 minutes, it's a pedestal with rusted bolts, and you're like, oh well. And there's lots of different pieces we could get into about like sort of when you start trying to piece together the barbecue speech he gives during his life, and you start kind of seeing um, how that really plays out and what we do know about it is so fascinating. Those are always kind of nice little surprises in terms of how you can kind of create narratives out of something you didn't think was enough to make a narrative out of. That's from the writer side of me, right? You're thinking, do I have enough here? One thing I was going to add is that the actual book was going to have sort of, I had always kind of planned like maybe almost like a photo essay,
Mm.
and I had this idea of maybe we have these images and I could get the images and have this kind of, and that never really worked. It works when you're working on chapter 1 and 2, and that's
Mm.
chapter 5 or 4, and you're thinking, well, that's just what I'm going to do there. But when I started getting into it, then it became part of um, the novel that comes out, The Devil's Dream, and then that became more of a hook than I thought it was going to be, and then it became much more of a story of how he's used, you know, within the, like, I hate to say this word again, but the sexual nature of it. That was a surprise in terms of how much that became part of a narrative I could work with. But when you start a book, as you know, you start a book and you think it's going to be this, and all of a sudden you add a chapter or a chapter disappears or whatever it is. But that was part of it.
Well, yeah, that's part of the writing process. It just goes in the
I
way
have
it goes.
plenty to talk about. Then you get there and you're like, I have nothing to talk about. Or more often you're like, well, I don't really need to say much there. And then it's like,
Yeah,
15,000 words. And you're like, oh, okay,
I
well,
had more than I thought.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, so just as a second surprise sort of curiosity here on my part. Your book is out for, I mean, just check that. It is out for a year now, so over a year. So how,
September of 24, it came out.
yeah, so how's your, like, how's been the reaction to it? Do you feel like the populace has sort of, have you received a lot of hate mail from neo Confederates, Memphians who are upset at you for the stories you tell?
I more often than not will get, no, not really. I have gotten a couple of comments or requests with people who have their own sort of Forrest story, like a great 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 grandfather had something, and I find that interesting. Um, I haven't there's been sort of a self edit. There was some commentary by someone who's actually in the book, who kind of disagree with a large part of it, but I think that's to be expected. I will say that one of my favorite uh, reviews, honestly, was, it's on Amazon, but I was very happy to see someone picked up on the humor of it, because I think there are parts that are quite funny, and I think that you don't want to say, "Hey, Forrest, what a cut up
Mm-hmm.
of a story," because there's so much darkness in it. But I tried to have sort of an eye toward irony and an eye toward some of this, and I was really happy to see that came across in some ways too, because I think the book, honestly, let's say you're the biggest Forrest supporter in the whole world, you probably won't like the book, but I would think you'd still get something out of it, and I
Mm-hmm.
do think that it gives you a sense that, um, I think that there's a way that I talk about it that I think, hopefully could be seen in a way that you don't normally see Civil War stuff talked about. And I think that the Civil War, with you in particular, it's interesting to talk about this because it's like I'm not someone who spent 30 years writing about the Civil War, writing about the Civil War, writing about the Civil War. And in fact, some of the most difficult parts for me as a cultural historian was the stuff that Civil War people generally like to talk about, which is sort of the war part. And I found that part to be more challenging as a writer.
Mhm.
Uh, but the thing is that I'm not a military historian at all, and I think that my viewpoint from a cultural perspective, um, I think plays off differently. And I mean, I would argue at least should be part of the conversation. But I think that that part is interesting. What I also felt certainly when I delivered the manuscript was, and this is more of a personal point, but the idea that, you'd kind of been playing with this for so long.
Mhm.
And not just because you've been writing a book, but just, as you know, as the historian mind doesn't shut off, you're
Mhm.
constantly thinking about this stuff. That may not be positive, but you do. And I was like, it was kind of like not a final chapter, but the idea of feeling uh, proud to get the story out in the way that I wanted to. I very strongly felt that. Not that there's not errors in it or pieces when you're like sad when you see that one paragraph that you kind of fucked with, but 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 there's something that was very I felt very purposefully um uh at ease with kind of finishing it. And I felt
Mhm.
like it was saying it mainly and in most ways saying what I wanted to say. Not, of course, as the final story of all things, but I did feel that. And I think over the last year, um, when I have the ability to talk about it, whether in the classroom or in forums like this, it's kind of nice to go back and think about it as a
Mhm.
project. Um, uh, which is very different from the stuff I do with like, let's talk about a Bob Dylan song that means
Mhm.
something to me. And I think as a writer, there's something about digging into music or digging into those kind of things that make you feel so strongly connected
Mhm.
to your life, if
Yeah.
you're into music or whatever it
Yeah.
is. But then when you talk about this stuff, it's so, I didn't spend a lot of years on someone I admired. I didn't
Right.
spend all these years on someone that was really giving back in so many
Mhm.
profound ways. It was like, oh, you're really dealing with. I mean, I have so many friends and colleagues who work with the darkest parts of like the Klan, and I don't know how they can
Yeah.
continue to get up and write every morning or whatever about it. It's a very challenging subject, and it's not a subject. I mean, this isn't to go against what I was saying about the humor, but I think it's something to say about writers and colleagues and friends and historians who every day dip into the darkest recesses of what we talk about, and then to put that aside and go, well, let's talk about you know House of the Rising Sun or something. It seems like a positive daydream. So.
So, as a final question for the night or for the day, what do you want to replace Forrest as a statue?
Uh, for a very long time, for a very long time, I thought the answer would be, um, you know, someone like Booker T. Jones or something from Memphis, or like a someone from Stax Records, or like maybe even something like, because there was a time when I thought that was the kind of the epitome of where these things work best. And my friend Charles Hughes, who wrote that really wonderful book on country soul, does such a great job of sort of complicating and working on that. And I was like, maybe something like that would draw people to more
Mm.
in.
Mm. Yeah.
And my boring answer at this point is, do we need a statue? You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
do we
No,
do we
yeah,
need do we need something else like that? And
right,
it's like after all this talk about how complicated it is, it's kind of like, well, because I know there were the people who actively said in Nashville, like we need like a Dolly Parton statue or something.
right,
And I understand all of that, but I also understand that what's funny is that, and maybe you're similar ways. Every time you see a statue of someone that you do like, you're kind of like, is that really the statue? So you
right.
wonder, like, is that what?
Yeah.
Is that what we waited for? So maybe
Right.
maybe part of me is like maybe the abstract is so much better. Maybe
Hmm.
maybe a monument, an abstract monument to something such as Southern soul music would work so much better as a way of getting people. Because I do think what happens, and I do think the people who support all of the idea of monumentation and memorialization, I think what they do kind of understand is that there can be a spark of meaning there where it draws people in. I don't think that should be the story above racism and racial violence by any means, but I think there is something to that where you can see something and it draws you into knowing
Hmm.
something more about something important. And in that sense, then maybe a monument to Booker T and the MG's record or something might be, or Otis Redding or something might be the best way forward to it. But I do think that coming out of this, um, you do become sort of almost cynical to the idea that of how memorialization works. Having said that, I find myself thinking almost every day more and more about memorialization than I ever have. I think that it's not just Civil War memory, uh, though that's still very important to me, but the idea of memorialization um, and memory, I think, is more a part of my writing and part more of work than ever. So I guess to punt, I'll say I would have clearly said uh, uh, a Memphis musician back in the day, and now I will say that perhaps something more abstract would work best.
I like that. Well, then, at this stage, thank you so much for taking over 2 hours of your time for
Niels, this has
this
been great. I loved it.
incredible conversation.
I really
Uh,
appreciate what you brought, and our correspondence and our conversation has been great. So I
well,
appreciate it.
thank you. And for those who are still listening and who might now actually want to buy the book and read some of the witty stories that you weaved into with the irony,
The
uh,
picture doesn't, the orange and the red doesn't really come across, but
it
you
is
can
a
have it on your website.
yes. It will be the background picture. So, LU Press's Reckoning with the Devil. Um,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you, Niels.